James Galbraith, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So, Sunday the 5th was, July the 5th was a very big day in Europe, an extremely important one for Greece. The people of Greece voted overwhelmingly to reject the bailout terms set by the institutions. They voted no in a bid to end 5 years of painful austerity. Can you give us a quick synopsis of the lead up to the referendum and your thoughts on these past 5 days?
Well, it's a very peculiar situation. The referendum became necessary because Alexis Tsipras realized, I think at some length, on the 26th of June, that the institutions were not prepared to give him anything that he could bring back to the Greek parliament that would be acceptable. Greeks had come up with a proposal which made really drastic concessions to the enforced austerity that they've been under. They simply wished to do that in a different way by increasing taxes on high-income individuals and on business profits of a certain level. The institutions refused to accept that and insisted on cuts to low-income pensions and on increases in the value-added tax, especially out in the islands where it was very disruptive to the tourist trade. So that was an impasse that had to be resolved somehow. I think it's fair to say that the expectation on the part of the Greek government was that given the alternative of a no, which they recommended, and a yes, which would avoid a closure of the banking system, and given the extreme campaign of intimidation that was pursued in Greece, they expected that the Greek population would vote yes, and that the government would then be under an obligation, by the basically mandate of the people, to sign on to the terms and put an end to the crisis, even on terms that they themselves regarded as being very damaging and unacceptable. That was the extent to which they went back into the corner. Interestingly, and very much to their credit, the Greek population said no. They stood up and they were very brave about it in face of a week of fantastic amount of media intimidation and efforts to instill fear and anxiety in the population, which simply, the population simply refused to buckle under. And so you got the referendum result that you saw on Sunday night. However, that didn't change the underlying situation, which is that the government had no options short of taking Greece out of the euro, which they were unprepared to do, and did not feel a political mandate for. So they were faced again with the necessity of coming back and attempting to extract at least the cover of some debt restructuring and refinancing as a price for accepting most of what the institutions were demanding, the creditor countries were demanding. And that's what's happened. Obviously, Yanis Varoufakis departed in good order, because that would have been something extremely difficult for him to take responsibility for as finance minister.
So, well, there has been a lot of criticism, especially from the left, regarding the Syriza government's strategic approach to the negotiations, with some saying perhaps it was a bit naive to assume that the so-called European partners were ever willing to negotiate in good faith. Can you respond to that criticism? And would there have been some other strategy that they could have taken that would have been any more successful?
Well, the Greek government, particularly the person that I spoke to, has been speaking to all the way through, we're not under any illusion about the hard line that the creditors are going to take into January forward, and stated both publicly by them and in private by Wolfgang Schäuble. So the fact that the creditors were not going to give anything short of the original memorandum was something that was eminently clear to insiders from the very beginning. But that's something that you have to demonstrate to the larger public. It's not obvious to the wider world that this intransigence is the case, and particularly when the European institutions, through a very powerful media machine, kept talking about how flexible they were. The IMF kept saying how flexible they were, and basically spreading an entirely different cover story to the world. So the Greeks had to stick with the negotiations up to the very end in order to
basically in order to establish what the true terms of the discussions were. I think that's now clear to the world.
You assisted former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis in the negotiations. Something that I think a lot of people might find interesting is how these negotiations actually function. There's not a lot of transparency on what goes on, except for when the European Union decides to leak strategically whatever it feels like leaking. I think it would be interesting for people to understand, the reaction perhaps to Syriza and this left-wing government coming into European politics at that politics at that level.
Well, there are many things that one can say about that. One that comes to mind is that the European the institutions and the collection of finance ministers known as the Eurozone were plainly unprepared for and quite shocked by the audacity of a government coming in with a well-articulated critique of the entire policy structure under which Europe has been laboring for the last 5 years. And that created a very considerable amount of tension because it's something to which they had no credible response. So the response that they chose was to go after Yanis Varoufakis particularly personally, and to make him out in the press to be something quite different from what he actually is. And that, is a reflection of their raw power with respect to the media, and also to the complete lack of scruple in dealing with this difficult and this government that was difficult by virtue of the fact that it was expressing ideas that they did not want to hear, that were plainly well-argued, well-grounded in fact, and plainly very difficult for people who were committed to contrary ideas to accept.
Yes, well, you have this. You have a lot of. You have this rhetoric with. This idea that Syriza is inexperienced, and there's quite a lot of condescending talk with Christine Lagarde saying that they need adults in the room and such talk. So it seems apparent, at least from that one side, was this basically a one-sided assault? It didn't seem, from our view, to come from the Greek side.
There's no question that it was the whole process was extremely one-sided. You had the representatives of one small country whose admittedly were new to government, and they did not have the staffing that would be required really to go up against the establishment that they were facing. And on the other side, you had an enormously entrenched bureaucracy and all of the powers of Europe behind them. So yes, it was extremely one-sided. And what the approach the other side took, the European side and the IMF took, with every Greek proposal was just simply to say, go back and do it again. Not acceptable. They never gave any ground of their own. They never came back and said, here's a concession we're prepared to make. They weren't prepared to make any concessions. They simply said, and toward the end, they were utterly blatant in the threats that they made, that if the Greeks did not come to terms on the precise terms specified by the institutions, then the European Central Bank would act in such a way as to destroy the Greek banking system and to seize the deposits of the Greek citizens. And that is a very powerful threat, as once your banking system is gone, your economy cannot function. That is basically... So what we have here is an agreement at the end of the day. It's not an agreement. It's a contract that's being signed under force majeure, under coercion. It's a contract which will, I think, be considered in history as a very infamous act of really blackmail.
Yes, okay. So I think we'll stop it there, and we'll continue our conversation in part 2.